We celebrate that we are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. We covenant to learn from one another in our free and responsible search for truth and meaning. We embrace our differences and commonalities with love, curiosity, and respect. Now please stand as you are willing and able as we sing our opening hymn, When the Heart is in a Holy Place.
When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we trust the wisdom in each of us, every color, every creed and kind, and we see our faces in each other's eyes, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we tell our story from deep inside, and we listen with the loving mind, and we hear our voices in each other's words, when our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place, when we share the silence of sacred space, and the God of our hearts stirs within, and we feel the power of each other's faith, then our heart is in a holy place. When our heart is in a holy place, when our heart is in a holy place, we are blessed with love and amazing grace. When our heart is in a holy place.
So welcome to the Unitarian Church. My name is Nathan. I'm one of your ministers. I'm so pleased to welcome you today. Online, we are glad you are joining us. A few things I would like for you to know. During middle hour today in room 6, we're having a series called The Introduction to Our Faith, and this week it is the question of who or what we worship and what we teach. So if you've ever wondered what we worship and what we teach, good news, we've got a class for you. This is not just for visitors, this is for anyone who would like to know all of the answers to everything. In room 7, the social justice sub-team on reproductive justice will be meeting during middle hour. 3 building things for you to know. 1, this little air conditioner, we have decided to spend the money and haul him out and put a new one in, but that happens Tuesday. So 2/3 of the sanctuary is air conditioned. That section is not, so we're okay. But just know that's what's happening with that AC. Because one of the air conditioners in the back heard about all the attention this little guy's getting, decided that they wanted some attention too, and so we are going to be dealing with them soon. We know some of the back is warm. If you're back there, just know we're aware. The next thing for you to know, there were 2 trees, hickory trees, that have been around since we had this church. Turns out they were dead, and we needed to remove them before a hurricane did it for us. So I just wanted you to know that there are 2 trees that are no longer with us on the campus. And finally, we have the teeny tiny little chairs. If you have not heard, we are trying to fundraise for chairs that we already purchased. So if you would give the church $25, there's a little box over there. You can just stick it in there. If you put cash, we don't know who you are. So put a note with the cash. But you're going to get a sticker that goes onto the folding chairs we already have that says, "Have a seat, courtesy of," and you can put whatever you want, which we will vet for appropriateness, but other than that, you can put whatever you want on that seat label. And you can get these little 10-cent cell phone holder chairs as a promotional thing if you would like as well. Today is our second installment of our Preacher Pack. And what I mean by that is we did a preaching class about a year ago, and we did a second version of the preaching class again, and this is the second person from the second preaching class we have, David Lindenfeld. And as the good Unitarian Universalist he is, he even brought in, this was not under the pressure from the ministers, he even brought in one of the new values the General Assembly of Unitarian Universalism passed last year, the value of pluralism, as your invocation. So that's where that came from. Welcome to this church.
A handful of religious systems now dominates our planet. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism account for the vast majority of the religiously affiliated, while Judaism, Sikhism, and Jainism mop up a far smaller number. Survey takers must then find a name for the forlorn category of the residuum, adherents of folk religions, which in 2015 made up only 5.7% of the world's population. Thus, the countless nameless traditions of ritual performance and mythic elaboration lie outside the world religions, and that provided the distinct habitat meaning in which humanity lived for most of its history have been subject to a merciless winnowing.
So let us have a moment of prayer. God of many names, Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, help us to understand the contours of the historical moment we are living in, when the cause of justice appears to be receding rather than advancing. In these times, preserve us from being dragged down into the quicksand of the us-them mentality, leading, as it often does, to an escalating cycle of recrimination, denunciation, demonization, extremism, threats of violence, and actual physical violence. Give us the courage to call out injustices when we see them and to fight them with appropriate means, and also give us the courage to try to understand the mindsets and perspectives of those who perpetrate those injustices, for only by doing so can we ultimately break the cycle. Above all, help us to be true to our Universalist values, that each and every person, regardless of their condition, has it in them the potential to be worthy of love. May it be so. Amen.
I couldn't find a better spot in the service to do it except for here. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the shooting at our former president yesterday. The Unitarian Universalist Association has made several statements condemning the attacks, saying that Unitarian Universalists value democracy and this attack is a threat on democracy. There are 4 things that I, as one of your ministers, want you to know as worshipers in this church today. 1 is there is a lot we do not know. We have data points, and then we have stories. We tell stories to connect the data points. Please pay attention to what you're hearing that's data and what you're hearing that is story. So what I mean is, you know that I'm standing here. You know that I'm wearing a stole. Those are data points. how I got here, whether I drove or rode my bike or whether I walked. All of those are stories you're telling in the absence of data. Stories are not bad, they're just not data. Does that make sense? Also, as it relates to stories, remember there is no rush to get information for any of us. Right now, our media environment is predicated on the feeding the addiction of fast information to try to actually blip the sort of dopamine receptors in your brain to find out that there's breaking news and to keep feeding that rush that you get when you get some information that is outside of the standard that you would expect. So just to pay attention that there is no need to rush on information right now, and it is okay to moderate what you're taking in. 2, while I am not saying nor do I have any way to know this, to know that this is politically motivated, I believe entirely that the intentionally elevated and hyperbolic environment has set the scene for this type of violence. Just last week, our governor accused a colleague of mine and members of this church of having and this is a quote, a Marxist, anti-American, and anti-Christian LGBTQ agenda because they sued Cade Brumley on behalf of the state of Louisiana for the state requiring their specific interpretations of the Ten Commandments being placed in every classroom. That rhetoric is dangerous, and it needs to stop immediately. Three, all politics is a shadow of the people. I'm willing to bet you have coworkers, family, and friends who espouse decisive rhetoric. Unitarian Universalists have, for the longest time, found individual absolution at the expense of universal salvation. What I mean by that is that we have found ways for us to not be the problem by separating ourselves from people we disagree with. You see this showing up as a church talking about how this church needs to be for like-minded people, or this church as a sanctuary from everyone else as if everyone else is unsafe. Often we do this individual absolution at the expense of universal salvation. We do this at the expense of what could bring about paradise on this earth. Yesterday can be a wake-up call to us to re-engage with our neighbors who we have separated from and left them to squander in oppressive theologies or ideologies. 4, this is the last one. There is not much impact most individuals can have nationally. I know that's not a very you thing to say. However, there is a lot that we can do locally, and the local politics here needs our attention incredibly. I actually had written out a list of everything from the school board to St. George to the legislature to the Public Service Commission. The list is ridiculous, and you could pick one and work on it, and the impact that we can have is profound. Please drive all of your processing of this event through the lens of a love for all people. That is the only way we get to the promised land. In terms of stones, we have 2. 2 cards. The first is a card for Herb Dyer. For those who do not know, he's a long-term member of the church. He has been suffering from dementia, and he has been hospitalized he's been hospitalized, and so we're going to send a card to him to let him know we're thinking of him. And the second, if you would place a stone, this death came as a shock to some in the church, but member Bruce Blaney died on Monday. Bruce was a long-term member of the church, one of the most vocal political voices I have ever met, and one of the funniest people that I know. He intentionally stayed up late the day before he died, and he was in poor health for a while. He got to watch Wimbledon, which was apparently a thing that he loved, and he got to stay up late with Jackie, his wife, watching old Star Trek episodes, way beyond when they would normally stay up, and he died in the night. Jackie is well taken care of, but she would need to know that this congregation is here for her. So those are the pieces of news that I have. This ritual is open to everybody, visitor and member alike. We invite those who wish to come forward either along the west or the east wall, take a stone, place it in the chalice bowl. Online, type your stone right into the chat. We invite those who wish to come forward as we place stones. And we say together, with hope to make this a better world, we light this flame. Its light is the symbol of the power of love.
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung, through every land, by every tongue.
So, good morning again, everyone. So, the title of this sermon is The Two Flavors of Religion. And its purpose is to share with you some of the results of my research and scholarship, which I pursued as a history professor at LSU, and which very much reflects my UU values. So, let me start by telling you how I came to these views. As for my personal story, pluralism came naturally to me because I was raised in a mixed religious household. My mother was a Quaker and my father was Jewish. We celebrated both sets of holidays, a Christmas tree in the living room, a menorah in the dining room, sang Silent Night in one room, Rock of Ages in the other. And this was all in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, known as the Christmas City. A bit more about my parents. My father was born in Hungary and immigrated to the United States in 2024, having witnessed the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe after the First World War. My dad had an uncle and a cousin who were already here who helped him get settled, and he eventually managed to bring over his parents and his two sisters before World War I broke out, thus escaping the Holocaust. He had in the meantime become a physician. In short, he lived the American dream and believed in it to his dying day. My mother was born and raised in Philadelphia and converted to Quakerism, having been raised Catholic. She too became a physician, probably one of the 2 or 3 women in her medical school class in the mid-1930s. She shared the Quakers' keen sense of social justice, and in our children's books, she always blacked out the N-word whenever it appeared. This was the 1940s. Incidentally, Pennsylvania was one of the first government entities in the Western world to officially pass a law abolishing slavery in March of 1780 during the American Revolution. Of the 2 religions that I was raised in, I came to identify more strongly with the Quaker one, despite the fact that I had been bar mitzvahed. The choice was between a belief in a chosen people versus the idea of God as accessible to all people. My parents sent me to a Quaker boarding school, and I came out of it with the realization that I was very fortunate compared to most other people in most countries, what we today would call white privilege. This motivated me to want to become a high school teacher in inner city schools. I was very idealistic. But a brief and traumatic internship convinced both my supervisors and me that I was not cut out for that. And I retreated to the ivory tower to get a PhD. My main contact with organized religion at that time was via music. I sang in various Christian churches as a paid singer to earn a little extra money in graduate school. And although I was not a believing Christian and never have been, Christian sacred music spoke to me as did no other, and continues to do so to this day. Sharing in the exalted status of white privilege did not, however, mean that everything was sweetness and light. My mother's sense of social justice was combined with a critical and judgmental attitude towards those who did not see things her way, and I imbibed this as well. And it took many years and many failed relationships with women to unlearn that habit. And insofar as that attitude was directed at me, it left me with a low sense of self-esteem that led to an intermittent struggle with depression, including a brief period of hospitalization. This happened just after I got my PhD and contributed to my losing my first job at Ohio State University. Fortunately, thanks to some very intensive and good therapy, I recovered rather quickly and was able to land a second job at LSU, where I arrived in 1974, not knowing a soul outside the history department. And with that, let's have our next hymn, Mother Spirit, Father Spirit.
Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, where are you? In the sky song, in the forest, sounds your cry. What to give you, what to call you, what am I? Many drops are in the ocean deep and wide. Sunlight bounces off the ripples to the sky. What to give you, what to call you, who am I? I am empty, time flies from me, what is time? Dreams eternal, fears infernal, haunt my heart. What to give you, what to call you, oh my God. Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, take our heart. Take our breath and let our voices sing our parts. Take our hands and let us work to shape our art.
Okay, part two of this sermon is entitled Religion as a Four-Dimensional Phenomenon. Now, it so happened that a friend of mine from Ohio State had done an internship here in Baton Rouge just before I arrived, and when I asked her where I should go to meet people, she said, and this is a quote, "Go to the Unitarian Church, and all else will follow." And this proved to be prophetic. Because I encountered here from the very first day that wonderful preemptive radical hospitality that Kathy Smith talks about. And it became clear that the principles of the dignities of all peoples and the drawing from the world religions fit my beliefs like a glove. And this has been my community ever since. I began my career at LSU teaching European intellectual history. Very heady stuff, also German history, European stuff. And I was always interested in the role that ideas and ideals played in history and the contributions made by philosophers and social thinkers and artists and writers. So that's what this course was about. And I also taught a lot of survey courses in Western Civ during those years. But about mid-career, in the 1990s, I underwent a sea change that would bring my academic interests more in line with my UU values. And that's when I realized that our students at LSU in the history department were getting almost no exposure to cultures other than the West. Aside from a lone historian of China, everyone in our department taught either American or European history. Now, there were a few courses in Latin America, but they weren't taught very frequently. So I decided to retool and train myself to develop a survey course in world history, which was a recognized teaching field by then. So I moved away from Western Civ to world history, and one of the things that fascinated me about that field was the notion of cross-cultural encounters, how peoples of different cultures and religions across the world interact with each other in various ways, for example, through trade or conquest or disease. And this idea of encounters was very firmly embedded. The textbook that I used was called Traditions and Encounters. And all of this was inspired by one of my teachers in the PhD program, William H. McNeill. You can have his picture of him. And here is what he had to say about encounters.
It seemed obvious to me that historical change was largely provoked by encounters with strangers, followed by efforts to borrow, or sometimes to reject or hold at bay, especially attractive novelties. Encounters with strangers are the main drive wheel of social change.
Now, I'd like to give an example of what I think McNeill meant with a book that I've been reading lately that really illustrates this process of cross-cultural encounters. It's the book Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wool Kimmerer. I'm wondering, have anybody here read that book or know it? A number of people have. Kimmerer is a Native American, member of the Potawatomi people, originally from the Western Great Lakes, and also who were then deported to Oklahoma. But she is also a professor of botany at a university. And in this book, she is able to move from her native stories of Sky Woman coming down from the clouds and seeding the earth to the language of Western science, of starches, carbohydrates, and proteins. And although she notes the tension between these two approaches, she manages to braid them together. This is kind of what I mean by cross-cultural encounters. So at the time that I was doing all this, I was casting about for a new research project that reflected my newfound interest and also highlighted the role of ideas and values. And one thing I was picking up from my study of world history was that religion mattered to many non-Western peoples rather more than it did in the West. So it struck me that one type of encounter which I could study that filled the bill would be to study the interactions between indigenous peoples in a variety of cultures across the world, on the one hand, with Christian missionaries on the other, who, of course, were showing up just about everywhere on the globe, but doing so from the perspective of the former rather than the latter. There are plenty of missionary histories from that point of view, but I wanted to invert the telescope, so to speak. And this was based on a premise that I share, that all peoples, no matter how subjugated, have some degree of agency to shape their circumstances. So this is what led to an 18-year research odyssey, which culminated in the book World Christianity and Indigenous Experience, which appeared in 2021. Now, another lesson that I learned in the course of these wanderings is that religion is not just about ideas and values. I kind of move away from that. It's more complicated. And I eventually came to view religion as a four-dimensional phenomenon. So we can look at that. Next slide, please. There we go. Now, some of you may find this scheme a bit too neat, and perhaps it is, but I find it to be useful. So, four dimensions of religion as I see it. First, there is the theoretical, which refers to the beliefs and values we subscribe to, and also the myths and narratives that we tell ourselves. Secondly, the practical, the actions we perform in the name of religion. Now, one would assume that these actions would follow directly from our beliefs and values, wouldn't we? And often they do. But in doing my research, I was struck by the fact that very often they do not follow directly from our beliefs, but operate kind of independently. And my own religious upbringing was a case in point, as was my singing in Christian churches. Now, to give a broader example, let me look for a minute at one country, that of Sweden. According to surveys, it is one of the least religious countries of Europe and perhaps the world, as measured by belief. Only 18% of the population believes in God, and only 3.8% go to church on a given Sunday. Yet, on certain occasions, the churches are full. And they are full when a rite of passage occurs, a baptism, a confirmation, a wedding, a funeral. So what is operating here, I think, is that family traditions count for more than creeds. People still find religion as a way of expressing the bondedness of their families and their community. And this operates kind of independently. It has a life of its own. In any case, let's now turn to an instance where our practical spirituality does follow our beliefs and values, namely the morning offering, which will now be gratefully received.
And that, my church members, is how you transition into an offering. This whole month, we are sharing the offering with Planned Parenthood of the Gulf Coast. Essentially, what half of the money for, and July it's not a 5-Sunday month, so we got to really fluff this to make sure we got enough money in it. But essentially, Planned Parenthood is working under the premise of four things. This is what a lot of reproductive justice work says. The right for people to have autonomy over their bodies, the right to choose to have children, the right to choose not to have children, and the right for children to grow up in a safe environment. That is what the ask is today, or at least half the ask. The other ask is for the church. Online people, there's like 1,000 ways you can give. I think we still put it right in the chat, but you can go to, it says it on the slide. I'll now ask the ushers to come forward as this morning's offering is gratefully given and received.
So let's go back to our fourfold classification. The third dimension of religion I call the experiential, namely those aspects of religion which grasp the whole person, particularly the emotions. The philosopher William James wrote a book on this, which he called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And sometimes these experiences can reach down into the subconscious mind in the form of trances and hallucinations. Now, I have a confession to make here, and that is I've never experienced such a trance or hallucination myself. But I have read too many accounts of other people who have done so to be not to be able to admit that they exist. In fact, one anthropological study that I found looked at 488 societies worldwide and found altered states of consciousness in 90% of them. So the fourth dimension I call the political. And this applies to religions insofar as they are organized and institutionalized. By this, I don't mean primarily the relation of church and state, but rather the structure of authority and power that exists within religious institutions themselves. In other words, who gets to pronounce on what is religious and on what grounds? And I think once one understands that structure, then one can better understand the various interplays of relation of church and state that we experience. So those are the four dimensions that I've worked out and which I find handy. And with that said, we are now ready for the big idea of the two flavors. But before we do that, it's time for the hymn of the month.
It's Healing River. Let's rise in body or spirit.
Oh, healing river, send down your waters, send down your waters upon this land. Oh, healing river, send down your waters and wash the blood from off the sand. This land is parching, oh yes, this land is burning. No seed is growing in barren ground. Oh, healing river, send down your waters. Oh, healing river, send waters down. Let seeds of freedom awake and flourish. Let deep roots nourish. Let tall stalks rise. Oh, healing river, send down your waters. Oh, healing river, from out of the sky.
So, part 3 of the sermon is entitled The Two Flavors. What I call these flavors are concentrated and diffuse spirituality. So, what does this mean? Well, concentrated spirituality means setting aside a certain time, a certain space, a certain activity, which we call sacred, as apart from the mundane, everyday aspects of the world. For example, think about what we are doing right here, right now. We are meeting for a service in a sanctuary, a holy place, as we sang about in the opening hymn. Now, by contrast, diffuse spirituality is that is being embedded in or intertwined with the world, sometimes in quite mundane material ways. So I'd like to look at one philosopher by the name of Charles Taylor for a brief quote, which I'll read, who was talking about the so-called folk religions that we heard about in the opening reading. And this is what he says about such religions in general. Quote, "What people ask for when they invoke or placate divinities and powers is prosperity, health, long life, fertility. What they ask to be preserved from is disease, dearth, sterility, and premature death. There is a certain understanding of human flourishing, which we can immediately understand." So this is the notion that diffuse spirituality is directed towards human flourishing in this world. Now, I want to caution you against thinking of these two flavors in a binary way. That's not either one or the other. It's pretty clear that we're dealing with a both-and situation here, and that a healthy culture attains to some sort of balance between them, a yin-yang, if you will. So I want to advance the notion that both types of spirituality are necessary to a healthy society, which is a notion that perhaps contradicts the widespread linear narrative of a society as advancing from the superstitious to the more rational, a narrative which most of us older folks, I suspect, grew up with. I certainly did. So how do we achieve this balance? We can do it in a number of ways. And to explore how this might be possible, I'd like to think of these two flavors as being refracted through the filters of the four dimensions we mentioned earlier, that these function as kind of like a prism that refracts the light from the two dimensions. And here is what this looks like, and we can kind of walk through this. So at the theoretical level, plainly, the contrast can be seen between the belief in one God and many gods, monotheism versus polytheism. Very few religions are entirely one or the other. Think of the Ten Commandments, which have been getting a lot of attention lately, haven't they? The first one says, "You shall have no other gods before me," admitting that there are other gods, right? It's there. But you better be careful how much attention you pay to them, as is clear in the second commandment of not making any graven image. And the consequence of violating that is pretty steep if you look at the Bible. Just look at the story of Moses and the golden calf when he came down from Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments and discovered the idol that his people below were making. What did he do? He ordered all of the idolaters slain, some 3,000 of them, according to Exodus chapter 32, verse 28. And this, I think, suggests to me one of the things about concentrated spirituality of belief. It contains within it a tendency to exclusivity, no matter how universal or praiseworthy its pronouncements might otherwise be. The very notion that God comes down to us at one specific historic moment in time raises a serious question for me. What about all those other people who have lived before or lived in other parts of the world? Of course, that's where missionaries come in. But I also think that the notion of things happening at such specific moments of God coming down at a specific time informs things like the notion the moment of conception in the Catholic view of abortion, whereas one could also look upon prenatal development as a process extended in time rather than at a moment. So I think that way of looking at things is very deeply embedded in monotheistic religions. By contrast, polytheism has a built-in tendency to inclusivity, since it is always easy to add one more God to an already existing pantheon. And this is how many indigenous peoples have dealt with the God of the missionaries. Also, many folk religious traditions acknowledge the notion of a supreme being over and above all these many spirits, but is often considered to be too remote from human affairs to be worshipped directly. So now let's turn to the practical dimension, where I'd like to talk a little about ritual. I like to think of ritual as a form of concentrated, practical spirituality, namely setting aside a place and a time for a repeated set of vocalizations and movements, such as the chalice lighting words that we recite or our hymn singing. And this is designed to create familiarity and reassurance among the participants and strengthen our sense of the sacred. Now, another more intense example of concentrated practical spirituality would be asceticism, and I really should have included that in the slide up there, but I didn't. What is asceticism? Well, it is renouncing some kind of worldly pleasure in order to focus one's mind on religion. And one thinks here of fasting in Lent or Ramadan. And so this is an important aspect of concentrated spirituality. And what is going on here? Well, it's not saying that food or sex are evil, but rather that we need to back away from them for a period to concentrate and intensify our energies for the spiritually informed task that we have to face. Think of Gandhi. He's a great example of this. He practiced celibacy throughout much of his life. So the diffuse flavor would be being out there in the world, doing social justice work in our church, getting out the vote. A lot of religions are involved in diffuse practical spirituality in a variety of ways, through healing, medicine, education, fashioning moral and legal codes. And here I would sneak in a rather good word for some missionaries. They often get a bad rap from us as imposing their views on others, and certainly much of this is justified. But they have also done a lot of good work in these practical matters, in medicine, education, such as teaching literacy, and I think they deserve some credit for that. Now for the experiential dimension, one thinks of the intense emotionalism of religious revivals, or of Pentecostalism, which today is by far the fastest growing form of Christianity worldwide, or at a milder level, perhaps, simply the experience of being together in community that we experience every week here. That's what draws many of us here, myself included. As for the diffuse flavor of the experiential dimension, I think of this in terms of private religious experiences, apart from an institutional setting, meditation at home, for example, or being in nature. And one can also point to the fact that increasing numbers of people in the West are finding religious satisfaction in this way, outside of an organized denomination. People who call themselves nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and many of them say that they are spiritual but not religious. In other words, they believe in some kind of a higher power or God. And a recent survey showed that 69% of the nuns fall into that category. Finally, the political dimension, one finds concentrated spiritual authority in the form of an elite with special training, such as an ordained clergy or shamans, as contrasted with the diffuse authority that ultimately resides in a congregation or community. Now, by the way, I kind of came upon this idea gradually when I came to Louisiana and spent time driving around, driving down River Road or any country road, and coming across all these tiny Baptist churches every few miles, right? That seemed to be a very good example of diffuse spiritual authority, that each of those congregations is kind of independent and separate. So quite often, concentration in one of these dimensions is offset by diffusion in another, and provides the balance. So think for a minute of Roman Catholicism. Extremely hierarchical structure of political authority, but a relatively diffuse spiritual belief system which makes room for saints, which are allowed to act as intermediaries between the believer and the Supreme Being. Contrast that with the Protestant Reformation, where just the opposite occurred, namely getting rid of all of those intermediaries and reaching God by faith alone. That was Luther's message. And that is offset by a diffusion of authority, empowering each congregation to organize itself, which leads to this proliferation of different Protestant denominations and sects. Or take Hinduism, with its luxuriantly polytheistic belief system of many gods, offset by its rigidly concentrated notions of authority in the caste system, including extreme patriarchy. And here I'd like to mention a Hindu feminist who eventually became a Unitarian by the name of Pandita Ramabai. We can see her in a minute, who wrote a book called The High Caste Hindu Woman in the 1880s. And she came out to speak out against the mistreatment of women in Hindu society, especially the arranged marriages with children and the treatment of widows who were regarded as virginal prisoners in their own house. So I'd like to give you a reading from Pandita Ramabai's book, The High Caste Hindu Woman.
I beg of my Western sisters not to be satisfied with the looking on of the outside beauties of the grand philosophers, not to be charmed with the long and interesting discourses of our educated men, but to open the trapdoors of the great monuments of the ancient Hindu intellect and enter into the dark cellars where they will see the real workings of the philosophies which they admire so much. There are thousands of priests and men leaned in the sacred lore who neglect and oppress the widows and devour widows' houses. Thousands upon thousands of young widows and innocent children are suffering untold misery and dying helpless every year throughout the land, but not a philosopher or a Mahatma has come out boldly to champion their cause and help them.
So Pandita Ramabai's beliefs eventually led her to Christianity, and she converted, but she soon found the notion of a Trinity to be equally unacceptable, and she turned to Unitarianism. Now I'd like to look for a minute at how this notion of balance has played out in our society in the U.S. in recent past, because I think we see something quite extraordinary taking place in the 1960s, and that is a shift toward diffuse spirituality in all four dimensions simultaneously. In the theoretical, we have an increased influence of the Eastern religions. In the practical, more and more clergy becoming involved in social and political causes. And in the experiential and the political, a turn towards privatization and the decline in church attendance. So it should not be surprising that we are seeing a kind of dialectical reaction to that in favor of concentration, as many Christians see their institutions and values under threat, thus feeding the polarization we see around us. And this is, I think, what often happens in a crisis, when people feel that they are in crisis, or are objectively in one, and that is, it tends to gravitate our views towards the concentration, because concentration of spirituality gives us that extra energy, that extra intensity, which we need to get through crisis times. But it again injures the balance, and I think that's what we are seeing going on around us right now. And this brings me back to pluralism and the need to redress the balance again. So let me conclude with a final paragraph in the book that I wrote, World Christianity and Indigenous Experience. And this is what it says. The argument for the preservation of such cultural diversity parallels, I believe, the argument for biological diversity. Both represent centuries, even millennia, of accumulated adaptation to their environments and thus constitute a knowledge base for a broader range of solutions to the challenges we are likely to face as a species than can be provided by a few hegemonic cultures and religions. And with that, let's sing our closing hymn, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee.
Joyful, joyful, we adore thee, God of glory, God of love. Hearts unfold like flowers before thee, hail thee as the sun above. Sin and sadness drive the of doubt away, melt the immortal gladness, fill us with the joy of day. All thy works with joy surround the earth, and heaven reflects thy rays. Stars and planets sing around thee, center of unbroken praise. Field and forest, vale and mountain, blossoming meadow, flashing sea, chanting bird and flowing fountain, call us to rejoice in thee. Thou art giving and forgiving, ever blessing, ever blessed, wellspring of the joy of living, ocean depth of happy rest. Ever singing, march we onward, victors in the midst of strife. Joyful music lifts us onward in the triumph song of life.
So, friends, let us go forth and embrace the world in all its richness, beauty, and complexity, warts and all. And let this church be a reservoir of complex love, of individual and communal strength to do that joyful work. Amen.